Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Textile Talk podcast. I'm Gail Cowley and I'll be your host today. Joining me for this episode is textile artist Fleur Woods. Just to give you a little bit of background before we start our chat, Fleur is a contemporary fibre artist, author, teacher and mentor based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Inspired by nature and drawn to fibres and textiles, Fleur has developed her stitched paintings through a decade of experimentation in her studio. Largely self-taught, she creates intuitively and her works evolve organically, often combining concept development and research as the pieces evolve. Stitch became a large part of her practice. Making marks with thread has overtaken brushwork due to the beautiful texture and dimension it brought to her pieces. A collector of all things vintage and pre-loved, many textiles and found objects are repurposed into her maximalist works. The Untamed Thread, Fleur's popular book, is part journey from corporate world to full-time artist and part creative inspiration and guide to the art of living creatively and developing an art practice. When she's not in the studio creating originals, dyeing wools and textiles, or creating other projects, Fleur can be found on the road teaching in-person workshops and hosting online gatherings with her joyful embroidery students, or enjoying creative conversation mentoring sessions. So Fleur, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today. I'm really delighted to have you with me for this episode.
Thanks so much for having me, Gail. I'm excited to chat with you.
And of course, we've had to do some organising, haven't we, to get this done, because it's 8 a.m. my end, and I think, is it in the evening at your end?
Yes, it's about 7 o'clock for me.
Yeah, so you've already done a day's work and you're having to turn back in to do this, so I apologise for that.
Oh, no, don't be silly. It's so lovely to be able to do it. I've got my cup of tea, so I'm good.
That's great. Yes, I've got mine as well. So I wonder if the first thing that I could do is just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you actually came to textiles. What brought you here? What was your journey?
Sure. I took a bit of a winding road to find my sort of true calling when it came to mark making. So initially I started out as sort of a mixed media artist, working with paint and collage, but for years I'd always collected vintage textiles, and especially those sort of little discarded tea cloths with the hole at one end or the stain from what in New Zealand we call an op shop. Do you call them op shops in the UK? But not sure.
No, we don't. Tell me what that is.
We call them an op shop. I don't know why actually, but a secondhand store or a little, charity shop.
Mm-hmm.
So I would rescue those and collect them and sometimes collage them into my work. But it wasn't until probably about 10 years ago now, I started to bring some stitch into my work. Just very simple stitches at first. I had absolutely no idea about how to stitch. I hadn't grown up with my grandmother's stitching around me, but I had grown up with their work around me. So some of their old cross stitches were on the wall, and quilts or tablecloths, hand-stitched tablecloths and things like that had been in my sort of periphery of my life, but I hadn't really realised what significance they held for me really until I did start to make the first sort of simple stitches into my work. And when I did that, I sort of felt this incredible sense that I'd found my form of mark making, even though I wasn't particularly good at it at the start. It just ticked so many boxes for me in terms of texture and colour and dimension, and just felt really comforting to physically do.
Yeah, I mean that's great, isn't it? Especially it's lovely to look at it as a generational thing as well.
Yeah, I kind of it was when I started to stitch, I mean, it sounds almost a little crazy, but I really did feel as though my grandmothers and great-grandmothers had sort of it was almost like a creative DNA. I felt like, "Oh, I know this somehow." It felt familiar in a strange way. And whilst I had a lot to learn, I think my first stitches one of the first flowers I stitched was into paper, and I managed to stitch it all the way through the paper because it sort of cut itself out because I just didn't know what I didn't know, and it was kind of in the time before, countless YouTube tutorials. I didn't have the language of embroidery stitches or really know how to even find out more information at that point, but it felt like coming home in a way. It just felt right.
And I mean, your work has such a really distinctive painterly quality to it. Can you tell us a little bit about how your background in painting informs your textile practice?
Yeah, yeah. I really I think because I didn't know anything about stitching or embroidery or any of the traditional techniques, I just knew how to paint. And I'd been painting sort of all my life really, but, for a number of years and probably, for a couple of years, sort of a little bit more full time. And so when I started to stitch initially it was first into my paintings and my screen prints and into collages, and I was sort of dragging the needle and thread through heavily painted canvases and things like that, just trying to bring that beautiful texture in. And then sort of I had a bit of a light bulb moment in the studio where I realized that stitches stitch into linen and painters paint into linen, and that's where I started to sort of play around with combining the two processes. And through combining them, I guess I really did approach stitch as if the marks were just a different kind of paintbrush. So in my brain, I was building up my pieces, with sort of blocking in base colors and then bringing in, light and shade and illustrative details and patterning and things like that, sort of quite intuitively as if I was painting a picture, as opposed to, I suppose, I guess now I can reflect that if I'd known perhaps other techniques, I might not have approached it that way. But I'm so glad I didn't know, really, because it just allowed me to use needle and thread as if it was my paintbrush. And
Mm.
it's a hugely satisfying way for me to work.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's a really interesting way of approaching it as well, because you've got all the qualities of colour and it's just I think a different way from perhaps the way somebody that had been embroidering for a long time would approach it. They would approach it in terms of technique, I think, and also materials. So
Yes.
they would be thinking about, the threads, what threads they would use and that sort of thing. Whereas you're coming to it from a completely different perspective, aren't you?
Absolutely, and what's been so interesting for me is it's really only I've been stitching into my work probably for about 10 years now, and it's really only in the last sort of 4 years, I'd say, that I've really started to broaden my knowledge of sort of fiber art and technique, because for so long I was just working very intuitively and building up my practice, and I really actually had no idea what an incredible fiber art world there was out there, and how many different materials and techniques. I was literally going to, the charity stores and buying little ends of balls wool, and just because I liked the colours, and, a lot of what I was doing was driven by colour and texture. I mean, for the first probably 6 months, I was stitching with a tapestry needle, I now realise, which was the worst needle I could have been using. Like, it was an absolute it was such hard work, and I just didn't know. And then slowly, I kept I'd stumble across something and try it, someone else's old discarded embroidery supplies, and I'd think, oh, I wonder what that needle does, and just try things. And it was very experimental and very much sort of trial and error. I'm not someone who at the time when I first started stitching, I'm terrible at like reading instructions. So it was sort of pre all the YouTube tutorials and things. And now you can so easily Google a stitch and see a million different ways to do it. But then I didn't know what they were called, and I found an old book that had some sort of stitch examples in it, but I really couldn't work out how to follow them. And so I just used to look at vintage stitching and sort of turn it over and go, oh, okay, so there's a knot there, and they've sort of gone all the way around, and it's sort of really worked. I really went the most muddly sort of random way about it, but in the end, I guess the gift of that was that I didn't know that I was breaking rules left, right, and centre, and
Yeah.
whilst there might have been some better techniques, I sort of managed to cobble together a process that felt really authentic to me. So,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose really it's amazing that you didn't get fed up. I mean, just thinking about the difficulty of pulling a blunt tapestry needle through. Your hands must have been so sore. It's amazing that you
yes.
just say, well, this isn't for me at that point.
Yeah, well, I think initially my stitches were very basic because I didn't have that knowledge, but I just loved the effect that they brought to the work, that it sort of became like an obsession. And now my works are very, very heavily stitched. But initially, it would be a painting with some elements of stitch. So I suppose that helped too, because the more I developed the stitch practice, the more I have stitched. And initially, my work was definitely not as heavily stitched as it tends to be now. Stitch has sort of become my preferred method of mark making, but initially it was sort of just a part of my process.
One of the things that I noticed from looking at your work on your website is that you have some lovely organic edges, which is something that's actually quite difficult for many embroiderers to achieve, I think. We probably feel more comfortable with something that's got a square edge, but you've achieved some lovely organic edges. Is that something that you do as a sort of definite goal, or is it something that you just do automatically, that you just enjoy the way that that's finished?
That's such a good question. I think majoritively it sort of came initially because I'm just not good at straight lines and precision. That's not really a skill set or a discipline that sort of calls to me. So I think it was almost like, and again, I didn't have that sort of understanding of how to display more traditional stitched work. So I didn't even occur to me to make it straight, really. I just initially would either have my work stretched like a canvas and display it that way, or have it floated on a mat board. And the more that I would see how the edges would come about, the more I loved that, because I think often nature is a big inspiration for me. And so, nature doesn't tend to do straight edges. So it was nice for me because I like to work quite organically too. And so whilst I often work in a square frame as I'm stitching or a hoop, but I just have never felt constrained by that shape. And I think mostly it was a happy accident. And then I just loved how it looked. And now I really like the artwork, even if it's stretched on a canvas, to sort of spill around the edge a little. I guess that gives the sense of being in nature, that it doesn't it's not just contained in one space, it's endless. So yeah, there's lots of things going on there, but mostly I think it just came from my inability to do things tidily.
I mean, I noticed that nature features really prominently in your work. what kinds of environment or specific landscapes most inspire you?
I mean, literally kind of all of them, but where I live at the top of the South Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and where I live is sort of fairly rural. I'm surrounded by fields and country gardens and vineyards, and then nearby there are beautiful beaches and national parks with sort of very dense and lush forests. And so I think I'm just naturally sort of inspired by any nature that I'm surrounded by. I'm sure if I lived in Rocky Mountains, my work might be slightly different. But the love of flowers in particular and intricate details in nature, they have just absorbed me utterly. And so I think for me, it's not so much about capturing the environment I'm in, but sort of the feeling of noticing the center of a flower or some little mossy mounds on the forest floor. I love rock pooling and beach combing. And so, yeah, it's sort of a way for me to celebrate and elevate nature and the feeling that I get when I'm in it.
I mean, your work's beautifully textural. Just looking at some of I think the one that I'm looking at here is called Rock Pool. You've got these gorgeous sort of three-dimensional pieces of I'm not sure whether it's moss or whatever it is, but how do you go about achieving that three-dimensional look and feel?
Yes, I love texture, and I try to sort of be guided by what I see in nature, but then I kind of almost turn up the volume. So it's generally, like on a physical level, a lot of the texture that I'm creating is either through punch needle or turkey stitch. So getting those lovely sort of fluffy mounds, and I love creating I call them nature's textures pieces, and they're sometimes rock pools and sometimes sort of more coral reef and sometimes forest floor, but the process is quite similar. I make little soft sculptural elements, which are often things like rope, a soft cotton rope wrapped with a wool or a fiber that I found, little sort of like bulbous sort of shapes that I've stuffed with. Often I try and use everything. So I have jars and jars of the excess thread that you get when you're ripping fabric, and the thread ends that you snip off. And so I shove those into little pieces of textile and sew them up and bead them. And my studio assistant, Miranda, she can crochet. So I often get her to crochet me some little pods that I can stuff with things and stitch onto. I love anything soft. I've used everything from, like new, like clean, but I'll go to like a dollar store and get makeup sponges or, just anything that I could
Mm.
stick through to make layers. I use a lot of vintage woolen blankets, anything soft that I can build a layer with. I only probably a couple of years ago learnt that that's kind of stump work, but I just, yeah, it's very playful. I sometimes use air dry clay and make forms that I can stitch into the piece. Sometimes I'll use beads and cover them with thread or fiber or paint them. Yeah, and it is really just building it from one mound of, say, punch needle, and then just allowing there to be valleys and mounds throughout the work. And it's kind of almost a maximalist dream, because I just keep adding more and more and more until it feels like it's a little ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah. I I I just that sort of leads me to wonder how much planning you do ahead, because that sounds like you're actually planning your pieces quite substantially before you start. Is that the case? I mean, do you design it
Yes,
and
yeah,
then
yes and no. So if I'm making a rock pool piece, I will literally take the monk's cloth that I'm gonna work on and roughly draw sort of a rough shape for the outline, and then some real sort of rough blobs in different positions, normally in odd numbers because I'm obsessed with odd numbers. Um, and then start punch needling and then fill the valley. So I guess I've just, through doing it, the only planning I really do, I don't have a vision in mind, but I do generally choose a colour palette to begin with and get myself like a nice sort of full basket of juicy little bits that I can draw from, whether it's, bits of hand-dyed velvet or some wools and some threads and beads and things, sort of like a little inspiration basket of the kinds of supplies I would probably use. And, if it's forest floor, it will be predominantly greens, for example. And then I will use that as sort of the basis of making the work. And then, it just happens. It just kind of organic, but pretty much it's just colour palette, rough size and form. And once the punch needle mounds are done, I start to fill with all the little weird little elements that I've made and then stitch into that more. And sometimes they grow, and sometimes there's many little islands of them. I've done big ones like 1 metre by 1 metre. I've done 2 metres by 1 metre with islands coming off it. I've done all sorts of them, everything from 15 centimetres up. They're lots of fun to make.
I'm sure that they look lots of fun to make. It's really interesting that you mentioned the size, because actually, unfortunately, it's one of the things you don't really get a great deal of idea from just looking at something online. So it's really interesting to have a size put to them as well. I mean, with that sort of intense stitching, 1 metre's huge, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, and that's how I came to punch needle for the really fibery mounds, because initially I was making them smaller and I was using turkey stitch to make that, and that's such a sort of laborious process. It's a beautiful stitch.
Mm.
I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it because
Yeah.
I love the look of it, but I don't love doing it for hours on end. And so that's when I sort of, decided that there might be a different way to do it. And a friend of mine taught me how to punch needle, and I was like, this is the thing.
Mm.
So that allowed me to scale up in a way. And when I'm doing a larger piece, I do a bit more preparation in terms of the elements that I would add in, so that once the punch needle's done, I have that sort of satisfaction of being able to immediately stitch some great sort of soft sculpture clusters and things in, and it really starts to build quite quickly. And then the longer part of the process is adding the more intricate detail. But I love that bit. I'm such a detail geek. So
Yeah.
it's sort of my treat at the end of getting all the layers down is to add the detail.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you describe the process of your work as being slow and meditative. That's very much referring to hand embroidery. When I look at your work, I think, well, as a machine embroiderer, I think, oh, well, I could speed up this bit or that bit
Yeah.
by putting it under the machine. Have you ever been tempted to do that, or do you think that it would actually sort of destroy part of the process for you?
I'm always open to different techniques, and not that long ago, last year sometime, I made a piece. It was actually one of the pieces that's in my book, and it is a large piece of linen that I'd painted with water lilies, and I just never nailed the composition right from the start. I sort of knew it, but I thought I could fix it, and I found I couldn't. And so I ended up cutting it all up, even sort of large hand-stitched flowers that were sort of bigger than my hand. I would just cut them in half. And then I decided that I was going to make a really large piece with the cut up bits of stitching, of which there were lots. And so I got a piece of beautiful vintage Sanderson fabric and used the reverse of it, and used my sewing machine to run through these sort of free style lines that caught each of the pieces almost as a way of tacking them down. And then I stitched back into the work further. But And I liked that, actually. I've got to say, I did quite enjoy that. And I'm so intrigued by using sewing machines and quilting and all those different techniques that are available. But I'm not very good friends with my sewing machine. So I tend to, it's weird because my process is so slow and I don't give up on that. But the minute my sewing machine isn't doing what I want it to do, I'm very quick to give up on it. So, yeah.
I think a lot of people would think that as well, that it's almost an ongoing fight with their sewing machine.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I haven't met a sewing machine yet and because I'm not very good at following instructions, what I'd really need to do is go to a class and have someone show me how to use it properly. And then I could probably have all kinds of fun with it. But pretty much all I use my sewing machine for is I call it tangle fabric. And it's just basically like a layer of tulle or lace and some sprinkled thread ends and tangles with a layer of solvy over the top to make sort of a tangle fabric. And I run that through the sewing machine a bunch of times to bind the layers together. But that's pretty much the only time it gets an outing.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, I suppose, an interesting thought for the future if you ever decide to do that. And you mentioned workshops, but I know that you run workshops yourself, don't you, and to share your practice with others. What is it that you've learnt during that process about people's reactions to stitching?
Yes, I never thought I'd teach workshops, but many, many moons ago, before I was stitching even, a friend of mine was running a workshop series in a town nearby to where I live, and she asked if I would teach a workshop. And I sort of said to her, "Oh, no, I don't think so." And then she said, "I'll pay you." And at that point, I really wasn't earning any money from my art, and I was like, "Great." I'll be there.
Yeah.
And so I taught a mixed media workshop for a weekend, and I just had the most fun creating with people from all different walks of life and ages. And I thought, wow, I actually really, really love this. And then it took me quite a few years to start teaching more. And certainly when I first started stitching, people were asking me, because I'd been teaching mixed media workshops, would I teach the stitching? And I sort of really didn't feel qualified to do it for quite a long time. And I still don't really. But what I realized is that I'm not really teaching stitching. I do share my process and techniques and things, but really what I'm doing is facilitating creativity for people.
Mm.
So what's great for me is that I get to work with people who have come from all different levels of experience. So often my workshops have a really mixed group of experience levels, and everyone from a complete beginner through to a practicing textile artist. And so many of the stitchers that come to my workshops actually know way more stitches than I do and different techniques. And we sort of learn from each other and we create together. And for me, it's often people say that they come to me to try and learn how to free up their embroidery or how to let go of some of the rules that they've learnt perhaps along their journey, or that they want to approach it in a different way, or work with colour. I use a lot of wool in my stitching and a lot of people are very interested by that, and some people find that very, very hard to do, because it's quite hard to take a process that you've done for a long time and then do it in a very different way. And because I develop my work so organically, I ask people to trust me a lot. And it's such a
Yeah.
slow process, so it takes a while for the work to come to life. And so really the workshops are about gathering together around a table and soothing ourselves with creativity and making connections with fellow kindred spirits who love to create and learning stuff. But the learning stuff is almost the byproduct. I think I've
Hmm.
realized, like, that sort of will always happen. But the gathering and the confidence building and the trust in the creative process is what really interests me with workshops.
And I suppose obviously a group of people, or like-minded people, enjoy doing something creative all gathered together. If that was a different technique, so for example, if it was counted cross stitch, it would be a very, very different vibe, wouldn't it? Because you'd all be having to concentrate on counting from a graph,
Yeah.
whereas that's being able to use just sort of hand embroidery stitches in a more spontaneous way is allowing you to get on with whatever's in your hands, to enjoy the stitching, but also to talk as well. So I imagine that it fosters a much more communal feeling.
Yes, and, I've honestly it hadn't occurred to me until I started working with a lot more fibre and textile artists and teaching at embroidery guilds and things like that. It never occurred to me that that would be any other way, because my process is so sort of freestyle, I suppose. And so it is, for some people, really, really liberating to come into that kind of environment. And for other people, it's actually a little bit challenging because they are used to being perhaps in a more kind of structured learning environment, and feel a bit safer with a pattern to follow and, a set colour palette. I'll often provide sort of a plethora of materials and give people options. And quite regularly in my workshops, it will be advertised as a textile collage workshop, but someone will end up making a rock pool and someone else will end up doing something else.
Mm.
And I love that, because for me, it's not so much about teaching people to do what I do. It's more about helping them find out who they are as a creative, and because we're all drawn to different techniques. And so if someone really starts vibing with a certain technique, and maybe it's texture for them, or they actually came to a floral workshop but really they love leaves, we'll just reorient the work that they'll create in that time to their interest, rather than sort of my process. So I think that's only because I taught myself, and I couldn't I couldn't facilitate a workshop where everyone was creating the same thing, and not because there's anything wrong with that, but that's just not how my brain works.
Yeah, yeah. And so how do you go about describing the workshops when you're doing them? Is there a particular description that you give that allows that level of, divergence within the workshop?
To be honest, I do try and promote each workshop as its own theme.
Right.
But I guess it's just more that for me, it's really about, I guess one of the things I do describe is that my goal is to meet people where they're at, with the experience that they have and the creative goals that each individual has. And for some people it might be a creative goal to become more free and use more texture in their stitching. So I'll sort of direct them towards the wools and the chunkier fibres, and maybe ask them to extend the length of their stitches. And then for someone else, they might be a complete beginner, which, to be honest, can be quite an advantage sometimes, because they're not having to really think hard about doing it a different way than they've always done it. They're just diving in and having a play. Yeah, so I guess it's quite playful, and even though I do generally try and structure the workshop so that it can meet the advertised theme, it's just
Mhm.
lovely to be in a position where the group size and the resources are of such that it means that we can sort of work to everyone's unique interests and skills
Mhm.
and goals. Yeah.
And obviously having you there and having that support must enable people to go a little bit out of their own comfort zone, so that if they've come to it because they're a knitter or a cross stitcher or whatever, they can then take perhaps the skills they have and add to them by using different techniques, and feel that they have you there, that they can ask you and you can say, yes, why not consider putting this there or that there. I suppose it gives them a little bit of reassurance, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's really what it is. I feel my role is obviously to share any knowledge that might be useful, but and materials and techniques, but it's also, yeah, very much just sort of working out with people where their challenge lies and what would be meaningful to them, whether it's that they really want to be able to, there's someone who've always followed a pattern and they like the idea of creating their own work, but they don't know how to transition from following someone else's pattern to creating their own. And I can sort of work with them to work out what that could look like. Some people love drawing and other people are terrified by it. And so is it a scenario whereby we print out an image and trace it for them? Or, how do we get to those places together? And for me, that feels like being, I guess, as women, sadly, I don't get guys come to my workshop. I would love guys to come, but I don't see. I think I've had one guy in all my years. But as women, we often come to a workshop from very full lives and a lot of mental load, and so I sort of feel like if I can help take away some of the pressure of the creative process and some of the sort of unfair rules that we give ourselves sometimes, and some of the pressures that we may put on ourselves to complete something marvelous, and rather try and encourage people to find joy in the process and trust that in time they may create something they're really happy with, but even if they don't, that they will have learnt some really important things about who they are as a creative and why they don't like that thing, and perhaps that's not to be repeated, or perhaps it's just that they need to practice it some more, and how to work that out, sort of how to work out who you are as a creative is where my passion really lies. Yeah.
Your art does feel very deeply rooted in a sort of sense of place. How do you think that living in New Zealand influences, well, your creative outlook and also your daily practice?
That's such a lovely question. I think it really influences my ability to lean into the seasons and the pace of nature. I can imagine that if I lived in a big city, I think we are influenced by our environment. We're so geographically isolated here in New Zealand, and we're surrounded by an abundance of nature. And so I guess those things absolutely allow me to feel very connected to that. And that influences my practice by sort of allowing me to flow through the seasons with my practice, to be very connected to what's happening in the physical world around me. And also, I guess, when I'm home, when I'm not traveling to teach workshops and do other things, I'm able to, like, it's quiet, and I'm able to sort of hermit myself away and just do the work, and it doesn't feel as though it's important for me to go and seek anything else out. And I don't know, I think luckily for me, the rest of the world has a bit of a love affair with New Zealand being this slightly nostalgic backwater, a very beautiful backwater at the bottom of the world. And us Kiwis we are, sometimes miles behind and much slower, but we're also sort of a bit, we call it number 8 wire. We're sort of really innovative and playful because I guess over time, because we're remote, we've had to work with what was available. And so there's this sort of there's a real Kiwi sense of exploration and ability to carve out your own little niche, even though you're in this tiny country at the bottom of the world. But we've sort of got this desire to still share it with the rest of the world. It's a funny thing. It's hard to describe, but
Mm.
and so I feel incredibly lucky to get to live in this little tiny rural town and send my work all over the globe. And yeah, it's a weird and wonderful thing. I'm actually both my parents are British and I wasn't born in New Zealand. So I guess technically I'm actually British, but I think of myself as a Kiwi. I moved here when I was 8 years old, and there's something about the Māori culture as well that is very rooted in myths and legends that are, you know, completely connected to the cycles of the moon and the seasons and nature and the land and the rivers have sort of personage. So yeah, I think there's a real sort of playful, whimsical Kiwiness to my work, as well as having sort of, I guess we have colonial British influences and my own culture comes into all of that as well. And then the nature all around me. Yeah, I don't
Mm.
know how that makes it different from anyone else's, but it feels very real and tangible for me in my practice.
I have actually been to New Zealand a couple of times, and the thing that really struck me was the respect actually that is given to art and craft in general. It's it's something that appeared to me. Now I know I was doing a little bit of teaching when I was over there. I was staying with some students of mine. So obviously from that they knew I was interested in stitching, and they would take me to places. But still it struck me that, there was a real respect given to it, and perhaps a different way, certainly to the one that we have here in the UK. I mean, have you found that to be the case?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think when I initially started stitching into my work, it was sort of not particularly easy to connect people to the story of Stitch being more than a hobby craft and that kind of thing. But we've come a long way since then, and object art and craft is now, I think, more publicly celebrated. But I think you're right, because we have connections to the land in such a way that often our materials are even related. The woolen blankets that I stitch into every day are made from, you know, the New Zealand, the high country mountains and the merino sheep that I grew up around. There is this embedded connection to craft that I think is still celebrated in beautiful ways. I think we have the same problem as everywhere else in the world, that it doesn't get perhaps the support that sport or other industries gets. But I think what's beautiful is that when you're in a small country, you can, I think, more easily connect into your niche community in a way. It's people know each other, and so I think there's access that perhaps might be harder in a bigger
Mm.
place. Yeah. But it's typically underrepresented and underfunded, just like everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think Kiwis are proud of anything that we make. We're really, and I guess we've had to be, that's because we're little and we love to export wares, whether that's our wool or our agricultural products, whatever that is. Yeah, so I think we're very proud when someone comes to visit to share whatever we have got, even if it's not that much. So, yeah.
I was just so impressed with some of the shops. I remember being taken into, I think it was a bead shop in Nelson,
Oh, yeah.
and I don't know if it's still
It's
there.
not it's not still there, sadly, but it was
Ah,
wonderful, wasn't it?
it was absolutely amazing. I have
Yeah,
never been anywhere that has had that amount of beads in one place.
yeah.
I mean, there's nothing that I can think of here that would even come anywhere close to that. I think possibly, I mean, I don't really know, but I'm just guessing that perhaps some of the retail space isn't quite as expensive. You seem to have I went into another lovely sewing shop, and that was in Wellington, in the outskirts of
Mm.
Wellington.
Oh,
I can't remember the name of it, but again, lots of space. Things were beautifully displayed. You had lots of space to look round. I think because we tend to, whatever we do here in the UK, tends to be very squashed up. We're obviously we have a lot of people and squashed in a very small space. And that means that retail space, whatever, tends to be very expensive, probably too expensive for crafts which don't perhaps have the same higher turnover. So I wonder if it's that, or I wonder if it's just simply that, that Kiwis just do rate crafts more highly than we do.
that's so interesting. Yeah, I think you're right about the space. I think what seems to have happened a lot in the larger cities and sort of on the main streets when the rents are higher, there used to be lots of in Nelson, near where I live, there used to be, it used to look, you'd arrive and it looked very creative because there were a lot more galleries and craft stores, and we're a region of a lot of really talented ceramicists and jewelers and things like that. So it definitely presented itself that way. It's changed a bit in the sense that the sort of the main drag of most towns is the chain stores that you see sort of everywhere. But what has been really wonderful is that New Zealand art and design has been sort of celebrated ongoing in those more niche stores and different pockets, and people really support it. I have a friend that runs a beautiful store in Nelson called the Little Beehive Co-op, and it's full of local artists and national artists' work. And every time I go into town, the main street is quite quiet and her store is always busy. And I think it's just perhaps also a sign of people, if they are going to spend money on something, wanting it to be a bit more connected and have more meaning to it. And so they're really, seeking out those special things and valuing handmade. And I do definitely think that that's something that we like in New Zealand. Me and the same girlfriend started a handmade Christmas market. She said to me the other day, it was 13 years ago we started it. And on the first ever time we did it, we thought, oh, look, not many, maybe we'll get a couple of hundred people, but 3,000 people came. And I think
Oh my
that's a
goodness.
real sign of the desire for the handmade.
Mm.
And that does matter to people and they value it. So, and some places probably more so than others, but yeah, I do definitely think there's a joy and appreciation for it, and people probably do have more space to really merchandise really creatively and kind of have fun with their spaces. When you're in a small place with a limited audience, and particularly post-COVID, because the tourism was such a big part of New Zealand's retail survival, I think that has really encouraged those that are passionate about what they do to really do it well, which is wonderful. It means we
Yeah.
get the benefit of some very special people and spaces and stories being told about art and craft, and connecting that back to the creatives that have made it, really personalising it, which is special. Yeah.
Because textiles, I think, generally can be quite undervalued within the art world, within the context of the art world. It is often seen as the poor relation. Um, do you think that that's changing? And where do you see embroidery sitting within contemporary art at the moment?
Yeah, I do think it's changing. I remember back in sort of 2014 when I was first stitching into my work and trying to explain to people that it was art, and they just looked at me like I was mental. And now I don't find I have to explain that. I feel like it's entered more of the mainstream creative consciousness as an art form. And I think globally, some of that is due to the sort of couture and fashion houses that have had, probably for the last 8 or 9 years, kind of really explored embroidery and crochet and quilts and all sorts of different traditional textiles in a contemporary way. So I think sometimes when it's out in sort of mainstream culture in different ways, that really helps to elevate the value and perception of it as an art form, because it's such an ancient art form. But it's sort of, I think now, certainly for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been able to continue to elevate the value of my pieces. They're very kind of avidly collected, which is such a bonus. And I work with a lot of practicing and emerging textile artists to try and help them to feel confident to really value it appropriately, because of its link back to, I think, domestic craft and you know, in New Zealand we call it nana craft, or you know, people perceiving it as something that they could perhaps do in a weekend can be really, really tricky. But, you know, and social media and all of those things has really helped to amplify it, I think. And I certainly feel I saw something on social media, and it was from, I can't remember who posted it, but it was, I think, like an art curator. So it seemed fairly legitimate, that said that fibre art was the largest growth. Contemporary fibre art was the largest growth area for art in 2024. So that, to me, was really encouraging. And
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I hadn't
yeah,
heard that. It's really interesting.
yeah, I was kind of surprised and pleased. And I certainly feel that the number of people that I work with on, you know, sort of a workshop level, and then, you know, they go on to continue and turn it into either a full-time role, full-time creative practice, or a part-time creative practice, has really increased in the last 5 years. And I think that a lot of people are self-representing now, and, you know, things like YouTube and all of that stuff has really helped artists to create platforms and communities for themselves. And so, yeah, it's exciting to me. I think it is being celebrated more. I'm seeing this sort of resurgence of interest, and I certainly haven't had to explain my work to someone looking blankly at me like I'm mad for about at least 5 years. So
Oh, seems like things are looking up then.
yeah.
No, it's a nice thought actually that textiles is becoming more prominent, because it was always seen as let's say the poor relation really. And actually I think that it's, if anything, I think it's more difficult, more challenging than, I'm going to say just fine art, but then producing a painting or producing a drawing. Because obviously you still very often produce that as a guide beforehand, but then you have to translate that into fabric and stitch, which is often where things can go awry, isn't it? If you don't make the right choice at that point, then things don't work out correctly. So I think it's actually, you know, it really takes a substantial skill level, because you need the artistic side, but you also need the techniques and the knowledge of materials.
Yeah, and I think that's what excites people, and why it's sort of moving into really exciting spaces. You know, I love seeing all the sort of soft sculpture work that's happening, and installation pieces, you know, people doing incredible things with rugs and tapestries, and, you know, everything from tiny works through to ginormous works, and sort of the expansion of what we see as fibre art going beyond perhaps domestic wear. And, you know, even so wonderful to see people kind of really, you know, quilting has always been absolutely massive, but now seeing contemporary quilting become kind of massive. That's so exciting to me, because I think that what people are realizing is that there is a intrinsic value in something that takes time and dedication and mastery. And I think with, you know, that there was a time when we were sort of looking to speed everything up, and it does feel a bit like the world could still want that. But I think the reason for the resurgence is because there is this sort of natural sort of comfort that the idea that this work can still exist in a world that is on hyper speed and is sort of grounding for all of us, even when it's very contemporary work. It feels somehow familiar because textiles are, our first ancient technology kind of thing, so I
Yeah.
just, that I think there's something about fibre and textiles that is, and now how people are reimagining it in different ways is just, I just think the interest and desire for it is going to continue to grow.
Yes, I think it's actually an interesting thought that it's something that we can't complete very quickly. It's something that's going to
Mm,
take a period of time and require a commitment of time from us in order to complete a piece. Because hand stitching is hand stitching and you can't massively hurry it up.
mm,
So I think maybe that acceptance in a world that is very focused on immediacy, where we're used to sort of being
mm.
able to order things immediately on the internet. We're used to being able to sort of comment immediately on things on social media, know about everything that's going on. And actually, I think accepting that you're doing some hand stitching, it's going to take time. This is a project that's going to go on over weeks, if not longer. It slows you down, doesn't it? And it sort of helps that acceptance that not everything's immediate gratification.
Yeah, and I think for both the viewer and the creator, there's so much relief in that. Once you can get over the fact that it takes an age to get anything, to make progress, and let go of those sort of more traditional connections that we have to productivity and progress and all of that stuff. I think I know that a lot of my collectors of my originals say to me that the works remind them to slow down, that they get drawn in by the intricacies of them, that they notice something new each time, they take time to notice. So it's interesting to me that the physical materials and the finished work give the viewer that sense, and they also give the maker that. And that is just such a beautiful, interconnected thing that kind of transcends, the
Yeah,
story of the work and all of that stuff.
yeah, it is actually, isn't it? It's a lovely sort of synergy that not only has it been enjoyed by the person who's created it, but it's also continuing to be enjoyed by the person who has eventually received it, however that might be,
Mm.
whether they purchased it or been given it as a gift. And as you say, it's giving them something to look at and to consider each day in the same way or a slightly different way perhaps than it did the maker. It's a really nice synergy.
Mm. Yeah, it's beautiful, and I think it gives us a connection. It's sort of an invisible connection, but it's because textiles are such a foundational element of all of our lives. There's a familiarity there that perhaps isn't as tangible, I don't think, with some other materials, or some other methods. And I just think that's very, very special, and I feel sort of, as a maker, very connected to the past while not wedded to the techniques. And I think that's what's also exciting for the person that lives with, whether it's a little tea cloth that you've found and you're treasuring, or something you've made yourself, or something you've purchased. It's sort of, I think that's what is making people feel connected to it, as well as obviously the subject matter and the colours and the whatever else. But yeah, and it's the same when you gather people around a table to work with fibres. There's something, we were meant to do it. It's such a deep part of who we are as human beings, and beyond our sort of knowing, really. And there's a bit of an alchemy in that, which I really, really love.
So if you could collaborate with anybody, any artist, living or dead, across any medium, who would it be?
Oh, that's such an interesting question.
Sorry.
No, that's a good one. Oh gosh, probably I would really I often think that I would really love to collaborate with a fashion house, maybe Dior, just small goals.
Mhm.
Dior or Alexander McQueen are my two favourites. Just there's something about fashion and couture that I think has not that I have the physical skills to be able to do it in the way that they do it. I know it's such a precise technique, but just I have so much admiration for it and how it kind of becomes wearable art, and there's something very dreamy and aspirational about the storytelling, and it it transports me when I see couture pieces and fashion collections and things like that really, really inspire my work often. So I think that would be pretty amazing. I'd love to be let into the back door of that and understand the process a bit more, and perhaps can contribute to the colour or textural design in some way would be an absolute dream. But there's so many sort of incredible. There's also like quilt artists who I just adore. Heidi Parks is one of them, and it's endless really. So I don't know if
Yeah.
I can choose just one,
It
but
was a bit of a cheeky question on my
yeah, no,
part. I'm sorry.
it's a lovely question.
So, just obviously, I know that we're coming towards the end. I can't believe it's gone so quickly. But um, is is there anything that you have coming up in the future that you can tell us about? Or, any books or exhibitions or anything like that you would like to let us know about?
I would. For any listeners that don't know my work, I have a lovely book called The Untamed Thread. It is available in the UK and around the world, and folks tell me that they really enjoy it. It's not a how-to kind of guide. It's more of a little bit of my journey from corporate world to becoming a full-time artist, and then a lot about my process and inspiration, and it's very close to my heart. I am in the process of writing my second book at the moment, but I'm not quite sure when I'm going to be done with that. And I am going to be teaching in France next year, which I'm very excited about. It's a bit of a hike. To
It
come
is
over
a bit, isn't it? So you have to pack up your entire studio, do you, to take it across to France?
I definitely will be hopefully trying to limit it to a couple of boxes.
Mhm.
But I'm going to be teaching a textile collage workshop in a beautiful place called Clos Mirabel and in the southwest of France. So that's exciting. And I'm just working on a collection of new originals at the moment. So yeah, there's always something great happening. I'm lucky. I love projects. So I've also got a new product collection coming out. I have my work reproduced onto last collection was some velvet clutches, and this time is going to be some more velvet based things, a tote bag and some other gorgeous bits and bobs. And I
Wonderful.
produce those with a wonderful agency here in New Zealand that focuses on amplifying artists' work in beautiful ways. So yeah, so lots of good things coming up really. And I just if anyone's interested, I normally share that on my Instagram or via my newsletter, and um
Mhm.
yeah.
Wonderful. So we will share those links with the listeners for this episode so that they can obviously sort of view and get in touch if they want to. Thank you so much, Fleur. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and thank you for staying up way beyond what should be office hours to do the interview for me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me and for providing a platform for, us textile artists to share what we do. It's really special and really valuable for all of us. So thank you.
It's something I really enjoy doing actually. So it's really, I don't count it as hard work. It's a real pleasure.